Hello, welcome to the first ever episode of Music and the Meaning of Life with Alan Childs. Our first episode is going to be about Jimmy Page and why he's actually an underrated guitarist. In the future, episodes are going to cover all sorts of musical topics, philosophy, religion, basically whatever I want to talk about, which is why I chose a nice broad name for the podcast. But today is going to be about music, which many of them will be. Jimmy Page, one of my favorite musicians, artists, and topics. So you might be asking, how could Jimmy Page be underrated as a guitarist when he's generally considered one of the greatest rock guitarists in history? Well, that's true. I don't believe that he is often considered the greatest, or that he often comes up in the first sentence of greatest guitarists. And I believe, not to tear anyone else down, because all the people that are mentioned as great, almost all of them anyway, are great in different degrees, but I think Jimmy Page actually outshines the vast majority of guitarists that he's often compared with. I don't want to name names and hate on other artists, even really famous, successful ones. I don't see the point in talking about why I don't like them. I will give the disclaimer that Jimi Hendrix is not one of the ones that I believe Page outshines. Just to clear up any confusion there, I think that Hendrix is rightly considered one of the greatest musicians of the 20th century, and I put Jimmy Page right up there with him. Why is he overshadowed? I think partly it's because of his own talent. I think that his songwriting often overshadows his guitar playing, and understandably so. The man literally wrote 50 classic songs, at least. It's insane, the catalog that he created with Led Zeppelin. Another reason is because of Led Zeppelin, his bandmates being most of them amongst the greatest of all time at what they do. So I think that not being the front man and having so much support around him and being such a well-rounded musician as a songwriter, I think that sometimes his guitar playing is overlooked. And I'm mostly referring to his lead guitar playing and his soloing and things like that. It's sometimes hard to separate the songwriting from the guitar playing. We can talk all day about the classic riffs that he wrote and the way that he uses harmony, which of course is part of his guitar playing. But I'm talking about him specifically as a guitarist, a guitar performer, a soloist, instrumentalist, and improviser. I think he was a master improviser, which I've learned from listening to a lot of Zeppelin live recordings and bootlegs. But first, I want to address a couple of the critiques of Jimmy Page. Some people say that he's sloppy, that he can't be one of the greatest guitarists of all time because his technique is not as clean as that of others, especially in his live performances. One will notice some sloppiness in his playing. He can rush sometimes. He can play ahead of the beat and be a little over-eager there. And those are true and fair critiques. However, I believe that there are many more important things in music than being a perfect technician. And I believe that Jimmy Page, on the whole, in the spectrum of musicians, is an outstanding technician. There are guitarists who play nearly every note cleanly to perfection. They hit every bend perfectly. They're in time nearly perfectly. Of course, no one's literally perfect, but there are players who get pretty close, and Page is not one of those players. However, I believe that Jimmy Page understands what music is really about. He understands the language of music. He understands why we're doing this, which is to make people feel, to express, to be creative. And in some ways, his lack of technique might actually be tied into his creativity. That said, I don't think anyone should settle for anything less than the best technique they can muster. We should all try to be as perfect as we can. But when you watch some other performers play, you can see how focused they are on their technique, and it can take away from the actual expression at times. We'll get to that more in a second. So those are the critiques of him, and I have friends who will only listen to guitarists who are nearly perfect in their delivery. They play clean, they play in time, and there aren't any of these distracting open strings that Jimmy Page will sometimes hit. You'll be listening to the live performance and, he'll just be playing a solo and you hear, this open string that he accidentally hits. I couldn't care less about that. It doesn't detract from it for me in any way. For other people it does, and that's a matter of opinion. But I listen to music to feel something and to be inspired by creativity and passion, and Jimmy Page has more of that in his pinky than most players ever have. So, segging into what makes Jimmy Page so amazing, I'm going to list a few things. One is that he is creative and he is surprising. Jimmy Page just plays different things than other guitarists, and of course, we could say that about anybody in a literal sense. A lot of what I say, can't be taken completely literally, but if you have a wide spectrum, a wide range of knowledge of what rock guitar is, or guitar in general, and then you listen to a lot of Jimmy Page solos, you'll just hear fresh ideas left and right. He's just a fountain of ideas. He's always bringing twists and turns into his playing, switching things up, doing things when you least expect it. He'll set up a certain idea and then play off of it and change it around. And of course, jazz players are masters of this, a lot more than rock players generally. But Jimmy Page has a lot of that, in my opinion. He just comes up with great ideas. How do you define creativity? A lot of the things I'm going to talk about are a little bit hard to define, especially in the format of a podcast. Within those confines, we could do a whole podcast on what creativity means, and I might actually do that. I'm planning to do one on what musicality is, which is something that Jimmy Page has a lot of. But you know it when you hear it. It's different ideas. It's being surprising, it's being playful, it's coming up with new ways to express things, either that other people haven't done or even within the same song or the same solo, and it just flows forth from him. It's interesting. The things Jimmy Page plays are very interesting to me. So that's number one. Number two, Jimmy Page plays free. And that ties into the first point. They're very much related. Jimmy Page plays free. He is not afraid to take risks and try weird things. I mean, he'll play stuff that doesn't even make sense sometimes. Hendrix does that too. It's like, what is that? And that makes it exciting. Now, it's fair to say that sometimes those ideas don't work. Sometimes Jimmy Page takes a risk and he falls on his face. I've seen that in some of his live performances. Or even if he doesn't fall on his face, it's just like, that didn't really go anywhere. But Jimmy Page is a risk taker. He shoots for the stars, pardon the cheesy metaphor, but he tries to fly, he tries to soar, he tries to go all the way when he plays his solos. He really reaches as far as he can go and digs so deep. And you can see it, you can hear it, and it has its dividends. It doesn't always work, but when it does, the magic is transcendent. It's divine. It speaks to me. It's a perfect example of why I'm a musician. And you can even see it when you contrast his live performances to those of other players who are perhaps not as free for whatever reason. Some of them, I think, are very focused on playing everything just right. They're trying to play things that are perfectly executed. Jimmy Page, as previously mentioned, is not as concerned with that. He's concerned with expressing himself. And you can see it in the performances. I remember one time I was at a party and the Led Zeppelin live movie, The Song Remains the Same, was playing on a TV just in the background. And I was kind of looking around the room and I think a little bored, and I just looked up and I happened to see that Page was playing the Stairway to Heaven solo, and I was just looking at his face. I don't think I could even hear the music, certainly not very well. And I saw this look on his face when he was playing. He was digging so deep. He was breathing heavily. His breathing was labored. He was so in the zone. It almost looked like he was channeling something. It's a cliche that's brought up in music and the arts, but you can see it. You can see that he's channeling something. It's incredible. And there's just that freedom that he can access. and you hear it in the playing. You hear it in the risks that he's taking. And there are a lot of players, I mentioned earlier, some I think are too concerned with technique, but I think there are others who aren't too concerned with technique. They aren't overly concerned with it, and they still can't play that freely. I don't know what explains it. If it's just a gift, that's, again, a whole nother podcast, but that freedom and creativity, they really tie together. Another aspect of his playing that's so special is that he truly speaks through his instrument. What does that mean? Jimmy Page has things to say. He has feelings that he wants to portray specifically. There is a language of music. I believe this. There is a language, a way that we express things through sound, and Jimmy Page is fluent in that language. He's a master of that language. When I hear Jimmy Page play a line or a solo or an idea, I know exactly what mood he's trying to express. And sometimes there isn't even an English word for the mood. I think those words often miss the mark, but I can feel it. I just know what it is. And I believe that music is often trying to imitate human language, the human experience, the way that we talk, the way that our actual language works, English in my case right now, but even just the way that we scream or moan or whisper, the way that we verbalize things, and I think that it's speaking to something really deep within us, and Jimmy Page is very much in tune with that. And to me, it's just written all over his playing that he has ideas, he has specific feelings he's trying to express, and he knows how to execute them. I mentioned musicality. It's musical, it's expressive, all sorts of different moods and feelings, and subtle ones too that a lot of players miss. And he's able to build to peaks. He's able to make long points too. And again, jazz players are masters of this. Some rock players are too. There are others other than just Jimmy Page. But I'm saying these things too. I probably should have said this at the beginning, but I'm hoping to help other musicians and guitarists who maybe are newer to music to understand these things and what to look for in great playing. If you're far along the path, maybe you've already talked about this a lot, maybe it was obvious to you at the beginning, or maybe I'm giving you some language to further understand why you like the things that you like. Maybe you already love Jimmy Page, but I'm trying to give language and give concepts to explain what it is about his playing that's so special and so magical. So again, he builds to peaks. He's able to make long statements. He's not the only musician or even rock guitarist who can do that, but it's something that's special in his playing. So look out for it, and not just in his, but in other players that you admire. Look at how they build a story, how they build their ideas, because that's what Page is almost always doing when he solos. And obviously in his songwriting, he's definitely doing that too, in even more obvious ways. So the last point I'll make about why he's so special before we dive into an example is that Jimmy Page has a signature style. Of course, every guitarist has their own style to some degree. No one sounds exactly like anyone else. But Page is an extreme and beautiful example of having his own style. There are specific licks and ideas and phrases that he plays that either that basically he only plays or that he utilizes in particular ways. Some of them he invented, some of them I'm sure he didn't invent, but he has, in a very literal way, just these specific phrases and passages and techniques that he uses. But it's more than just that. It's the way he puts them together. It's his touch. It's the way that he bends his strings. It's the way that he phrases, the way that he starts phrases and ends them. He has a way of playing a very staccato style that I find captivating, but that's not the only way he plays. He can play melodically and in a soaring fashion, but there's certain ways that he bends the strings. There's certain frequent styles or techniques that he dips into. One of them that comes to mind is what I call the Jimmy Page noodle, or the Jimmy Page the Jimmy Page slur. I don't know what you would call it, but if you're a big fan, you'll probably know what I'm talking about either already or soon, and he does it in this example solo coming up. But there's a certain way in which he plays a lot of notes very quickly together that is so uniquely him. It's like when he wants to go all out, when he wants to just, throw caution to the wind and just go for it and explode with a rapid fire of notes. Many guitarists do this, but there's a way that he does it, and to be honest, I'm not even completely sure what makes his sound so unique. I've copied it to some degree, but I don't even want to fully copy it or learn his fast passages note for note, because he's so signature. It would just sound like I'm just playing exactly like Jimmy Page if I were able to do so. I don't want to sound just like him, but it's so him. And whenever I hear this fast run of notes, like, oh, that's Jimmy Page, within a couple seconds of just about any Jimmy Page solo, I'm going to know right away that that's Jimmy Page because of the way he touches the strings, the way that he bends his notes, his vibrato, and again, these particular quirky phrases and quirky ways of playing fast and playing slow that he has. And I'll point some of them out in the example that we're about to check out. So this example, one of my favorite Page solos, it's a little under the radar. I'm hoping it's a little under the radar. There's so many we could have gone with, but this one is Traveling Riverside Blues off the BBC Sessions album. It was a live performance. There are some overdubs. It's not live from a concert. I believe it was done in a studio. But regardless, that's the song. That's all kind of beside the point. So it's a short solo, and man, does he say so much, and he illustrates so many of these points that I've just made in this solo. It's a shining example. It's one of my favorite solos ever. It's certainly one of my favorite short solos ever because he takes us on this perfect arc in such a brief period of time, and again, displays so many of the things that make him special with his own unique voice and his way of really speaking to the listener. So without further ado, let's listen to that, and then afterwards we'll go back and analyze it, pick it apart a little bit, and celebrate it. So here it goes. All right, let's go back and listen to the first phrase again. We're going to dive into each phrase, each part of the solo. There's so much to talk about here. There's an hour or two's worth of podcast, if not days, for topics branching off from those topics that we could get into with this, but I'm going to try to hit at least the high points in some detail of why I think this is such a special solo, why it's a perfect example of why Jimmy Page is a master, not just guitarist, but musician. Let's check out that first phrase. All right, here we go. Okay, so that was actually the first two phrases, and it's debatable where some of the phrases start and stop, and we could do a whole podcast on phrases, but what's worth noting here is that he starts off with clear, simple, melodic ideas. That's something that most great musicians do, but it's still worth noting. It's a concept very much worth looking for in your own playing and in that of others. It's simple, it's clear, and it's a fun mood that he's setting. He's setting up these ideas, and interestingly, he changes up the way he plays it throughout. So he's sort of repeating this shorter idea several times, and he repeats a longer idea once. And all throughout, he's playing it a little bit differently. Sometimes he ends the phrase with one note. Sometimes he just doubles it. He plays two notes where he used to play one. And then the biggest thing is at the end of what I consider the second phrase, he plays a different ending. So he plays this one segment, and then he plays it again, but he ends it differently. And that's a common and important and powerful technique in music, is to repeat phrases. And even though it's so simple and many, many, many musicians do it, it's still valuable and could be done more by, I think, a lot of great musicians. You don't have to change something up after you repeat it, but that's what he does here. And either way, it's powerful to repeat a little bit so that people can get used to what you're doing, and you're setting up a feeling, you're setting up an idea, and then in this case, because he ends it differently, there's surprise, there's play to it. He expresses something, then he expresses it again, but he changes it. The first time with the ending, he goes down. The second time, he goes higher and does a little flourish at the end, which I love. It's fun the way he does it. It's pretty, and it's actually even a little surprising to me for this genre. Like it's a very playful and, again, fun, kind of silly little phrase that he plays, but I love it. So let's hear what I consider the third phrase, which is arguably the ending of the second phrase. So here that goes. That's it. Again, could be considered the ending of the second phrase, but I consider it something new here because it's transitioning over into the next section of the harmony. The chord changes here. That doesn't mean it's a new phrase by any means, because phrases can continue into new chords. That's incredibly common and important. But to me, it feels like it's tacked on. It's almost like a little PS at the end of the second phrase, because really you would expect that second phrase to end after that little hammer-on flourish he does. And this, it's setting up a new idea. So everything changes. With these two notes, everything changes. It's incredible. We don't know up until this point whether he's going to solo over what we would call in jazz an entire chorus of the chord changes, or if he's just going to solo for a few lines over the root note chord, and then we're going to go back to the vocals. But the chord changes, and he plays these notes, so we know that he's going to solo over a chorus. We're like 99% sure of that at this point, 95% sure. We know it's going to continue over some different harmony. And what he does is he plays just two notes, and the second one is very long. It's in stark contrast to everything that's come before. Up to this point, all the notes have been pretty short. It's been melodic. It's been fun. But here he plays this long bend and this long note, and he leaves it to hang. And not only does he leave it to hang, but he leaves silence afterward. Now, the power of silence is critical. And Jimmy Page, like many of us, can be guilty of having a lot to say, as my former voice teacher used to say. He does have a lot to say, and sometimes it can be almost like a vomiting and a spewing of different ideas and a lot of notes, and a lot of guitarists, especially if they're technically gifted, unfortunately sometimes even if they're not, can be guilty of trying to play a lot. But here he leaves space. I was taught that in music school. Miles Davis was always cited as an example. He'll play a couple notes, a really simple idea, and then leave space. Let you hear it. Let it sink in. You wonder what's going to come next. What's he setting up? And this is very powerful in general and in this particular point, because we know more is coming. And whenever I hear it, I'm like, oh, what's he going to do now? So here's the answer. Let's listen to the next phrase. Okay, that was a very Jimmy Page phrase. The moods change completely. So we've gone from this happy, fun, melodic mood to this very angular, much more aggressive mood. His pick attack has changed. He's playing harder. He's playing faster. And then we get some of those bends, some of those more aggressive bends. And it's almost too much to go into to detail his bends, and no one can do it exactly like he does. Jimmy Page has unique ways of bending the strings and unique vibrato, uh, and some of it, I will say that there's a staccato style to it that you can hear at the end. He plays with the pace of the bend, like the acceleration of the bend, quite a bit. And he ends the phrase in a really angular way. He ends on that really staccato note, which I love. That's a very Page technique. So now, up until this point, it does sound like Jimmy Page for sure, but that phrase like screams Jimmy Page, and that's where we're getting into his voice. We hear not only some of the licks he likes to play, but his specific physical approach, the way he bends the notes, the way he ends his phrases, and his sort of signatures physically and musically in terms of what notes he's playing and the way he phrases things, the way he likes to end. He's a great ender of phrases. He ends phrases in these sort of sassy ways a lot. Jimmy Page is the sassiest guitar player I know of. It's almost like he's needling you sometimes. He'll play stuff really fast and then stop, like he's, just kind of trying to poke you a little bit. And I love that. It's a true communication with the audience. He has something to express to you, and through sound, he's almost literally reaching out and touching you. And I think that's a real gift that he has, is understanding that and being able to make us feel things. So yeah, it's an explosion. This phrase, like, oh boy, big change from before. And yet we know even more is coming. We know there's more chorus to go, and he's ramped it up. Where's he going to go from here? Let's take a listen. So that's what I would consider the fifth and sixth phrases. Here we get a bit more of a melodic sound. So we've almost gone back, which is a real gift. Only the best players can take us somewhere, then kind of take a step back, and then go even further. And how many people have the wherewithal to do that when they're playing? If a player is skilled enough to develop a solo in terms of intensity and whatnot, it's usually, like this. But he'll have waves in there where he's teasing us with what's to come and setting up our expectations, and then taking a step back and then going forward again. It's brilliant stuff. So it's more melodic. Here we get even more trademark Jimmy Page bends, these really fast bends. That's something that I've noticed. People who try to cover Jimmy Page often fall short in terms of, and I'm not saying I can do it perfectly by any means, especially if you watch my videos from a couple years ago. I know that I could do better now, so I should make a new one. But he does these very fast bends that are very him. You don't hear a lot of players doing that. And you also get another example of setting up ideas and then changing it around. He plays this one rhythmic idea and kind of melodic idea with that fast bend in it, and then he plays something similar that goes up higher, and it's a nice callback. There are a lot of comedy references, I'm realizing, comedy metaphors and crossovers. It's like a callback, as they say in comedy. You reference a joke from earlier, so he plays a phrase and then he references it again, even though it's different. And again, it's stimulating. It gives you something to latch on to. It's playful. It's intentional. All good things that separate it from just playing a bunch of notes in the key that are loud. Because, it's a lot of players are just playing notes in the key, playing them loud, playing them fast. Maybe they go slow and then fast or what have you. But this is light years beyond that in terms of intelligence and sensitivity and developing ideas. And then finally we get to the last phrase. So that was pretty crazy. The last phrase is just full-on Jimmy Page insanity. It's that Jimmy Page noodle, the Jimmy Page slur. And I said earlier that I didn't know exactly how he does it, and I haven't copied it exactly, but there's certain ways in which he goes up and down, and in which he does hammer-ons and pull-offs and slides that are just very much him. And he's built it up to this point. He's built it up to this crazy, insane, all-out finish. And then he ends with a nice, simple landing note with this bend. It's a clear signal that the solo is over. So to recap, we go from simple melodic ideas all the way to insanity, and in between we get playfulness. He brings us forward, he goes back. It's always shifting and moving. Every phrase is packed with ideas and interesting things, and he's taken us on a journey. In 40 seconds or so, he's taken us on a journey from this simple, happy, melodic feeling all the way to this all-out blues rock insanity, just as ferocious as it can be. And it's made sense. Somehow he's made that journey make sense. He's linked everything together. He's built us up there. And we end just thinking, or I do, thinking, wow, we just went on a ride in such a short period of time. There's so many wonderful solos of his that are very long as well, in which he also takes us on a nice little trip around a few blocks. But this one I think is particularly impressive in that it's so condensed. Yeah, there's much more that could be said about this solo, but hopefully it's given you some ideas and things to think about in terms of phrasing, the way he uses different moods, the way he plays with intentionality and feeling. And I should say too, at the end, it seems like he gets a little bit rhythmically off at the end, like he's not exactly sure how to end the phrase, which is so Jimmy Page, and it's just a great example of how he goes for it. I mean, by the time he gets to that crazy part at the end, the pinnacle, he's just going nuts. I mean, I doubt he planned that out very well in advance, and that's part of what makes him so special. He takes risks, so it's both. He's so intentional and careful, and then he also will take risks and just you can hear him sometimes feeling things out live, and just you can hear how he's going to go one way and then he changes his mind, because it's truly in the moment. He's truly channeling that creative power, whatever it may be. Some people think Jimmy Page sold his soul to the devil. It certainly does look sometimes. He's got his head cocked like he's listening to something in some earpiece that he has. I don't know who he's listening to, but somebody is giving him a lot of great ideas. I'm going to close with a few suggestions of other Jimmy Page solos to check out. Studio-wise, there's Whole Lotta Love. It doesn't get any better than that. He says so much, again, in a short period of time. It's iconic. Heartbreaker, both of those are off their second album. Lots of playfulness and creativity and playing with time and space in Heartbreaker. Stairway to Heaven, of course. Since I've Been Loving You, a masterclass in blues guitar all around. It's like super blues. 10 Years Gone is a very popular one amongst guitarists. It has a nice melodic solo with development and a lot of intentionality. And then there's some live ones that some of you might not have heard that I really want to turn you on to. There's How Many More Times, live at the Royal Albert Hall from 1970. That was on their live DVD that came out in 2003, I believe. It's also on YouTube. Just unchained creativity and ferociousness in that one. Ferocity. I Can't Quit You, Babe, and You Shook Me on BBC Sessions. Fantastic. So creative. Thank You on BBC Sessions. It's completely wild and intense, and yet also has these beautiful melodic moments, not unlike what we just heard, although it's a totally different style. Since I've Been Loving You on How the West Was Won, their live album that they released in 2000 or so, with some shows from California in 1972. And then finally, one that a lot of people haven't checked out is the album Jimmy Page and the Black Crowes from the early 2000s. And I love this for a few reasons. One, it's just amazing. Two, Jimmy Page is much older here, and it is absolute proof against the claim that Jimmy Page lost it after Led Zeppelin disbanded. There's this common thought that Jimmy Page never made great music again, or that he lost his passion, or that he wasn't good at guitar anymore, and that's not true. Some of the solos in here when he was 55 years old or something are just as good as some of his best work in Led Zeppelin. I particularly recommend Your Time Is Gonna Come. It's a melodic, beautiful, yet unchained and crazy solo at the same time. That's sort of a theme of his. And The Lemon Song, some great bluesy playfulness in that one. So check those out. Look for these ideas in other music. Look for them in your own playing. You might already be doing all of that, and if so, that's awesome. But he's been a huge inspiration to me. Listening to him has been just a tutorial on what music should be, in my opinion, because there's so much there, so much emotion and freedom and creativity. That's it for our first episode. I'm going to be making a lot more about music, a lot more about other things like philosophy, society, human nature, all kinds of fun things. They're all things that I think tie into my music, either in terms of music itself or thematically with lyrics and artistic ideas of that sort, ideas about life. I hope that you've enjoyed this. Please subscribe if you liked it. And I also hope that you'll check out some of my original music with my band Now. That's available at nowbandnyc.com or on this YouTube channel. So I leave you. Someone called my phone during my sign-off. I'm glad they didn't do it earlier. So still figuring out how to deal with that. I don't like airplane mode, but anyways, I'm going to end with my dramatic closing statement, which is, remember, it's now or never. Have a great day.